So before you start this job, you need to quickly flip open the bonnet and make sure your brake reservoir isn't too full. With you changing the discs and the pads at the same time, you're going to push a lot of fluid back into the reservoir and you could overflow it. Okay, so we're going to do the front discs and pads on this Astra. The first thing I've done is slacken the wheel nuts, then I've jacked the car up, and now I'm going to remove the wheel. I have put a piece of wood under the car just in case the jack should fail. So before we remove the caliper, what we need to do is, if possible, push the piston of the caliper back in. Otherwise you're going to struggle to get the caliper off because the disc is actually ridged on the outer edge. So the way I do this is a bit of brute force. You can see the pistons going back in. Ideally we want a little gap. There you go, got a little gap there now. Obviously if you're going to use the reuse the disc, you might not want to do this. While we're doing this, we might as well push the piston all the way back in, because we're going to have to push it back in to get the caliper back on with new pads and a new disc. So that's not going in any further. So it's nicely done. Thank you, Thomas. So now we can undo the caliper and drop that off. So the next part is to remove these two caps, which will give access to the Allen head sliders. Thank you, Thomas. And then the top one. And once we've got those removed, we can use a Allen key or a bit and a bracket. They shouldn't be too tight, these. So that's coming undone. I'll undo those and then carry on. So before I remove the caliper, I'm just going to have to get this retaining clip off. I think to do this, just prise it over. Once you've done that, you should be able to remove the caliper. Now if all you were going to do is change the pads, you'd just be able to clean up the runners here and put new pads in, but I'm going to do discs, so we're going to take this carrier off as well. And that's 2 bolts on the back, which are really tight and held in with Loctite, so they're really difficult to remove. So I've slackened these off, but they are difficult to remove right up until the end because of this Loctite. Okay, so I've undone both of those, difficult until the end, and then you can remove that. And you can see where the Loctite was here. So the last bit to remove to get the disc off is this Allen head screw in the front. Push down. That's right. These shouldn't be too tight, so your standard 8-year-old should be able to undo it. Right, now be careful because that disc can come off. You can pull the whole disc off. Don't drop it on your knee though. Wiggle, wiggle. Wiggle. Pull it all the way off. Bit heavy. That's right, well done. Thank you. So before we refit the brake disc, we need to make sure all the mating surfaces are clean and free from rust. So that will be the hub. You also need to make sure where the carrier mounts, that's all clean. So we're going to clean where the runners are, where the bolts go, and the mating surfaces on this side. The same with backs here. We're also going to clean up all the surfaces where the pads sit. We want all of that very clean to stop them binding. So that's what I'll do now, and then we'll be ready to refit. So before I start rebuilding this side, I've got the carrier here, and it's important just to clean all the surfaces where the pads sit. This was so bad, this one, that the pad wouldn't actually fit on without using a hammer. So you want it to slide nice forward and backwards. If one side jams, you'll get uneven pad wear. The tool I'm using for this is a little fibre wheel. You could also use a wire brush. It's important when you're dealing with brake dust to use a dust mask, and I've got goggles. Clean it. So before we fit these discs, it's important just to give them a clean, because they're going to be covered in a light oil just to stop them rusting in storage. So we've got brake cleaner to do this, and an 8-year-old. A bit more there. Perfect. And more. You want to test fit these bolts to make sure you're going to screw them in nicely. And if you can't, and you're worried you're going to cross thread them, then you probably want to clean out the threads if possible by screwing in the wrong way. Yep. So I'm happy that all the surfaces are clean and we've removed all the grease from the disc. I'll clean it again once it's on the car because I've got dirty finger marks over it. So now I'm going to give it to Thomas. Can you put it on so that hole there lines up with that hole, please? Don't put your finger in the middle, put it like that. Hold it. Right, you holding it? Do that up, please. Just tighten it up. Is that tight? Okay, it doesn't need to be too tight. So that's the new disc back on. So I'm now ready to mount this back, but the recommendation is you use Loctite on the screws again. So I'll just tighten them up, and quite tight. I use a torque wrench. It should be 100 Newton meters, I believe, but please check that. So let's torque these up. Right, so we're now ready to put the caliper back on. I've cleaned up the two sliding bolts here, and I've also put copper slip on all the mating surfaces, or on all the surfaces where the pads will slide. You can see I've pushed one of the pads back into the piston, which I fully pushed in right at the start. If you don't, you're going to have to find a way to push that piston back in. And now we're ready to put the caliper back on. Now I can see straight away I'm going to have to push that piston back in further. So I've got a piston winding tool here, and I'm just going to push against one of the old pads just to get that piston back in. You should be able to see that just squeezing back in. Just about there, I believe. Get that. There we go. Okay, so that's pushed back in. Let's try again. Okay, so let's try again. Make sure you don't get any grease on the surface of the disc, and that's looking good now. So just to help me retain this, I'm going to just push the clip back on. Very cack-handed. So now I'm just going to insert these two bolts just to retain the caliper. These are the sliding bolts, so I've put some copper slip on them. Don't forget to put the caps back on. And that is complete. Now we're going to put the wheel back on. And before we go herring down the road, we're going to press the pedal a few times just to reseat the pads.